What's up, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Warhammer Vermintide Advanced Weapon Tiers Guide. In this video, I'm gonna try as subjectively as I can to list, rate, and compare the relative strength of every single weapon in Vermintide. But before we get to that, there's just a couple of things I want to talk about first to set it all up. A list of disclaimers about how not to interpret my weapons tier guide, detailing what the weapon tier is grounded in, based upon, calculated on, and valued from. Then we're finally going to show the weapon tier guide, upon which I'll have to explain what it does and does not measure, what it can and cannot tell you, what it is and is not supposed to be used for, and then we're all ready and set up to go through the weapon tier list and hopefully make sense of it all, and try to top it all off with the top 5 list of the best weapons in Vermintide, both melee and ranged, across all classes. Anyways, first disclaimer. Now, should you find yourself in the situation of spotting your absolute favorite weapon in the trash pile that is tier C, then worry not. There's no such thing as an unviable weapon in Vermintide, at least not in the context of regular quick play. Every single one of these weapons can, on Cataclysm difficulty with the right know-how and a bit of mechanical skill, turn into a rad-ass whoop-producing mechanism. However, the effort required to do so can vary significantly. So how do you go about making a weapon tier guide? Well, the way I see it, there are 2 ways to approach this. Option 1. Make every selection exclusively on the basis of my game knowledge and experience, with which it would probably take me something like 2 to 3 hours in order to place every single weapon in Vermintide into the weapon tiers guide, assuming I put a fair amount of thought into it, and it doesn't seem unreasonable to assume that I would end up with something far from identical but still very similar overall to the weapon tiers guide that I actually have made. So why didn't I? I could have done it in 1/10th of the time and about a 20th of the effort. But you don't have to be a genius here to notice that there's a huge flaw about this approach, because it would no longer matter how accurate it was. Like, even if I had given every single weapon the same placement in the weapon tier guide, every single thing related to it from that point on would now operate in the domain of opinion, which is something I prefer to avoid at all cost when lecturing strangers. So I went straight for option 2. I mean, all I had to do was craft a set of simplistic rules with predisposition values, in which I could plug in specific metrics from a given weapon, and receive an output in the form of a primitive weapon score. Simply compare a couple of your output scores to certain predisposition weapons, to which your relative degree of certainty is high, and then simply tweak the rules a bit until the outputs create a reasonably acceptable picture in respect to things you already know. And boom! Tier list in no time. At least that was the plan. My god, I'm naive. There was nothing simple about it whatsoever, but it was too late. I'd made up my mind. You know, that moment of realization 10 hours later, having made up good progress, but so far still far from finishing, and realizing that at some level you just voluntarily sat down for 10 hours and did math and crafted rules. You're telling me I could have been motivated in elementary school all the freaking way? Like, I've always found math to come fairly easy to me, but I've never enjoyed it at all. Like, why exactly are we telling kids to calculate on bicycle wheels and milk cartons? They could be calculating their freaking kill death radios in Fortnite or some shit. Like, even when teaching kids about money, you swap out that lemonade stand for a CSGO economy, and I guarantee you if you told the 10-year-old me that I could use math to increase my freaking rating, I guarantee you that homework would be done in no time. Anyways, where was I? Yes, option 2 not working. So basically what I ended up doing was outsmarting myself by deciding that there was an option 3. It's called hard fucking work. So allow me to show what came of that hard work. And I promise we'll get to the weapon tier list right after. But in some very real sense, this is the weapon tier list. Anyways, I present to you the Warhammer Vermintide 10-step weapon evaluator. Made in a fucking Windows Note document like a true pro. Well, allow me to give you a quick tour. Now, the first and most basic thing you score is a weapon's ability to effectively deal with armor and infantry. Now, notice first of all that there's a greater range of points to be claimed from armor damage, as it goes from 0 to 5, while on the infantry score, it starts at -1 and only goes to 2.5. Now, why is that? Well, starting with armored, there's simply much more value to be extracted, but the shelf is also much higher up and harder to reach. Like, no matter how amazing a weapon is at slicing through hordes, it's simply not comparable on Cataclysm to, let's say, an executioner's sword with a one-shot breakpoint simply steamrolling through elites. But why does infantry start at -1? Well, assuming you're not entirely on your own, not being able to deal with infantry minions at all is way more dangerous than not being able to deal with armored minions. Like, you can avoid armored minions. They're big, they're slow, you know where they are, but there's no way you're gonna avoid infantry minions entirely in a Cataclysm run, regardless of how much you hug your team. Which brings us to the mobility and defensive scores, which is one of the areas I initially found was very difficult to tweak because I was thinking about it very one-dimensionally. Now, if I was in your shoes, but before having made this guide, I would have very quickly felt suspicious about the mobility scores seemingly yielding lower outputs than stamina and push block modifiers, but I forgot to take into account that the two are actually highly correlated, and everything seemingly fell into place as soon as I put some restraint on the mobility outputs, which made a lot of sense once I really started thinking about it. It's not that mobility as a concept is any less valuable, but it doesn't scale the same way. There's a reason having a dodge count of 100 isn't broken, and that's because a good Vermintide player really only needs 3, perhaps 4 if you're having a bad day. And the same exact thing can be said about the dodge distance modifier. Like, once you reach a certain threshold of, let's say, 10 to 20%, allowing you to comfortably sidestep things like a Storm Rim and Heavy, the value drops dramatically. Like, honestly, how often do you think an assassin would not hit your face because you had a 35% modifier rather than a 15% modifier? I mean, surely that scenario does happen, but it's such a small slice and comparatively irrelevant to you simply timing your dodge properly. Because if you don't, then neither modifier is going to save you, and if you do, then either modifier is sufficient. And again, keep the relationship between the two in mind, because the scores aren't actually that high when you think about it. It's really only the very top of the defensive scores where it sort of jumps, because that's when you equip a shield and basically sacrifice all of your mobility. But the one thing that all the best weapons in Vermintide have in common is being a jack of all trades. Now, it's not so much about being amazing at everything, as it's about not being terrible at any one thing. Like, being completely devoid of either cleave or armor damage in of itself is not a problem, but there are really only 2 ways to survive in Vermintide. So if you can't remove the danger, then you have to be able to remove yourself from the danger, whether that's by having really good block modifiers or high mobility. But honestly, the best weapons in the game can at the very least cope with either of the 3, likely excelling at some of the things, but very rarely entirely lacking either of the others. Now, both 6 and 7 only constitute minor value tweaks, and really the last important scorecard here is rule number 8, which determines the value of significant attack modifiers. But anyways, with that all said and done, I think we're finally ready to take our first look at the actual weapon tier list. So prepare, motherfuckers! And keep in mind that I've decided to stick 100% with my system in order to make the list, and then go through the potential anomalies or deviations on a case-by-case basis rather than tweaking the actual list. Anyways, I proudly present the Party Knife Warhammer Vermintide weapon tier list. Now, as you might have noticed, the weapons appear to be in quite a messy order, and the reason for this can be found in the top left corner. Basically, within any given square representing both a tire and a hero, the position of any given weapon icon in relation to the y-axis, aka up and down, represents a rough estimate of any given weapon's required input complexity, which can be measured in 2 different ways: the amount of variations in a given weapon's attack sequences, and how dependent a given weapon is on very specific attack sequences. Now, the reasons the sword and dagger, the billhook, and the rapier are all placed at the top of the complexity scale simply comes down to the variations of attack inputs, but take a look in the bottom left corner where you'll see the halberd. Now, the halberd has an equal complexity score, even though it quite clearly doesn't have the same amount of attack variations. So what's it doing there? Well, the complexity of the halberd is actually derived from restraint, meaning the slice of potential inputs that constitute viable use is limited to such an extent that there are things you simply have to know and have to do in a highly specific way, with a very small margin for error, making the weapon anything but simple to use. Now, another important thing to notice here is that the weapon tier of any given hero is not necessarily equivalent to the weapon tier of any other given hero, meaning there's no built-in relation between how good a, let's say, Kruper grade A weapon should be and a Carillion grade A weapon should be, and hypothetically speaking, it could be that Carillion's grade C weapons all had higher scores than Bardin's grade A weapons. Although that's obviously not the case, just understand that the weapon tier itself has absolutely nothing to do with how good the weapon actually is. It only has something to do with how well the weapon compares in relation to all the other options you have available. And I've chosen to do it this way because you're never really gonna find yourself in the scenario of should I beamstaff or should I longbow. And the whole idea of this weapon tier guide is to help you choose between weapons you already like, but for which you'd like to focus on the more viable of the two. But anyways, let's talk a little bit about some of the specific cases in which you could argue that a weapon has been scored unfairly. Now, starting with Kruber, there are really only 2 placements that give me pause. The first and most significant of which is the sword and shield. Now, shields have certain crowd control mechanisms that are hard to quantify in such a system, and this sword and shield in fact has really good attack sequences, and it's probably the only weapon any decent foot knight would ever use for something like high level weaves. But its score likely suffered due to it being a niche weapon, and personally I would have swapped it for the greatsword at the very least. Now, the second scenario is the relationship between the one-handed sword and the one-handed mace, which I feel like belong in the same tire, whether that be A or B. Now, moving on to Barton, I'm actually fairly happy with the tire placements of all his weapons, although I know I'm gonna get so much hate for putting his throwing axes in the bottom, and actually the exact same thing can be said for both Saltspire and Sienna, which leaves just Kerillian. Now, there are a couple of things that bother me about Kerillian's weapon placements, the first being the spear and shield, which in my opinion definitely belongs in the top tier. And that's coming from someone who really doesn't like to use it, because it bothers me so much that it blocks vision, but there's simply no denying that it has utility functions that no other weapon in the game has. Then there's the relationship between the dual swords and the dual daggers, which I also somewhat feel belong in the same tire, but the daggers have likely been bumped down due to my guide intentionally being quite punishing towards weapons completely devoid of any cleave attacks, which likely overpunished the daggers since they can cope fairly well due to their extreme mobility modifiers on top of being a dual wield weapon with the single fastest attack sequence of any weapon in the game. Similarly, the dual swords have likely been bumped up a little bit too high due to its extreme combination of both crit and mass modifiers on every single attack in its sequence. And last but not least, there is one weapon in particular which has trolled me all the way through the making of this video, and that's Kerillian's one-handed sword. Now, there's no doubt that the one-handed sword is highly underrated and highly undervalued by most players, and can definitely be considered a very viable weapon. However, I am pretty damn confident that it's not better than the sword and dagger, or even the spear and shield for that matter. But no matter what I did, it refused to be anything less than the second highest scoring Kerillian weapon and the third highest scoring of all weapons. But amazing as it is, I still feel like it should swap placements with the spear and shield. And just before we move on to the top 5 weapon picks, keep in mind that although I've tried my best to make it so, this is not an exact science, and making it so would require a precise simulation of every single weapon and its respective series of inputs versus and across all hypothetical encounters of every single variation of enemy type, density and combination, to which I have neither the correct equations or what I can only assume to be level 7 genius plus 1 squared access clearance required for one-on-one alone time with the supercomputer, which I know I'm a scrub, I don't have. So you know, take it with a grain of salt. But personally, I think the best 5 overall weapons in the game across all heroes has to be sword and dagger, it has to be the billhook, the spear and shield definitely, and I think the rapier and executioner sword finish it off nicely. Now, for the ranged weapons, there can be no doubt that the freaking bracer pistols are among them, so is Kerillian's longbow and the hackbane shortbow, and to top it all off we have Sienna's conflac and beamstaff. And goddammit, for whatever reason, the one-handed sword, it deserves a fucking Joker placement. You have no idea how hard I tried to tweak the rules in order to reduce its value, but no matter what I fucking did, it just refused to fuck off into tier B. And eventually I just thought, you know what, screw it, you've earned my respect. And maybe, just maybe, it's more amazing than I give you credit for. But anyways guys, what did you think of the list? Did you agree? Did you disagree? What are some weapons you would have swapped around? And what would your list of the top 5 best weapons look like? Don't forget to let me know down in the comments below. And look out for the part 2 Advanced Melee Mechanics Guide coming at you really soon. But anyways, that's it for me guys. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. And as always, I love you guys. Stay awesome. Peace out.
Bitch, please.